The moment he pointed at her, he thought he was in control, but he had no idea who he was about to accuse. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the busy downtown street, where traffic hummed and people moved in steady jerk, unaware they were about to witness something they wouldn't forget. Naomi Carter walked calmly along the sidewalk, her posture straight, her expression unreadable, dressed in a simple navy blazer and dark slacks that blended effortlessly into the city's rhythm. She looked like any other professional heading home after a long day, but there was something in her stillness, something in the way her eyes scanned the surroundings, not nervously, but precisely, that didn't quite match the ordinary. A few steps behind her, Officer Daniel Hayes leaned against his patrol car, arms crossed, watching. At first, it was just a glance, the kind shaped more by assumption than evidence, but that glance lingered longer than it should have. His jaw tightened slightly as his gaze followed her movements, as if her very presence disrupted something in his sense of order. Then, without hesitation, he pushed himself off the car and stepped forward, his voice cutting through the ambient noise. "Ma'am, I need you to stop right there." Conversations nearby softened. Footsteps slowed. Naomi paused, turning her head just enough to acknowledge him, her expression calm, almost detached. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her tone even, controlled. But Hayes had already made up his mind. "We've had a report of a theft in this area," he said, his voice firm, carrying authority that drew more eyes toward them. "You match the description." A few people nearby exchanged looks. Phones subtly shifted in hands. Naomi didn't move, didn't argue, didn't panic. She simply held his gaze, steady and unflinching. "I see," she replied quietly. That was it. No defensiveness, no fear. And somehow, that made the moment heavier. Hayes stepped closer, his presence now unmistakably confrontational. "I'm going to need you to open your bag," he said. The air seemed to tighten. A woman across the street slowed to a stop. A man nearby lifted his phone just a little higher. The city kept moving, but this moment stood still. Naomi glanced down briefly at her bag, then back at him. For a fraction of a second, something shifted in her eyes. Not fear, not anger, but calculation. Then, without a word, she extended the strap forward. Compliant, silent, but not defeated. Hayes took the bag, his movements sharper now, more certain, as if the act of control confirmed his judgment. He began to search, his voice rising just enough to ensure everyone heard. "If you didn't do anything wrong, this won't be a problem." The statement hung in the air, heavy with implication. Around them, the crowd grew, quiet, watchful, uncertain. And still, Naomi said nothing. She didn't look at the people filming. She didn't look away. She just stood there, composed, as if she already knew something no one else did. And somewhere, just beyond the edge of the crowd, a black SUV turned the corner. The zipper of the bag slid open with a sharp, deliberate sound that seemed louder than it should have been, drawing even more attention as Officer Hayes began to inspect its contents piece by piece, his movements slow but assertive, as if he expected to find something that would justify every assumption he had already made. While Naomi Carter stood motionless, her hands relaxed at her sides, her breathing steady, her eyes not on the officer but somewhere beyond him, scanning without appearing to look, as though she was measuring the entire scene in silence. A few feet away, a young man whispered to his friend, asking if this was really necessary, while another person raised their phone higher, capturing every second, the quiet murmur of the crowd building into a low hum of tension that filled the space between them. Hayes pulled out a notebook, flipped it, checked its pages, then set it aside with a faint scoff, clearly unsatisfied, his jaw tightening again as he glanced up at Naomi, searching her face for something, anything that would confirm what he already believed, but all he found was calm, a stillness that did not match the situation, and that unsettled him more than any protest ever could. "You seem awfully calm for someone in this position," he said, his tone edged with suspicion, as if composure itself was evidence. But Naomi only responded with a quiet, measured voice. "I have learned that reacting does not always change the outcome," her words landing softly, yet carrying a weight that made a few people nearby shift uncomfortably. For a brief second, Hayes hesitated, not because he doubted himself, but because something about her response did not fit the narrative he had already constructed, and that gap, That small crack in certainty flickered across his expression before disappearing just as quickly as he doubled down, continuing his search with renewed firmness. The air felt heavier now, the kind of pressure that builds before something shifts, before something unseen begins to surface. And Naomi knew it, not through fear, but through timing, because somewhere behind the line of parked cars, the black SUV had slowed, its engine barely audible over the city noise, its presence unnoticed by most, but not by her. She adjusted her stance slightly, a subtle shift of weight that meant nothing to the crowd but everything to someone watching closely, her gaze dropping for just a fraction of a second, as if acknowledging something unseen, then returning to neutral, her composure never breaking. Hayes, focused entirely on his task, missed it, too caught up in the performance of authority, in the belief that control belonged to him in this moment. Even as the scene around him began to change in ways he did not yet understand, a woman in the crowd whispered, "Something does not feel right," and another nodded, though neither could explain why. Only that the woman being questioned did not carry herself like someone cornered, but like someone waiting. And then, just as Hayes reached deeper into the bag, preparing to make his next move, the faint sound of car doors opening echoed behind him, subtle but distinct, followed by the quiet, synchronized footsteps of people who moved with purpose, not urgency. And in that instant, before anyone turned to look, before a single word was spoken, Naomi's eyes lifted slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition, because she knew exactly what was about to happen next. The sound of footsteps grew clearer, measured and synchronized, cutting through the low murmur of the crowd as several individuals in dark suits moved forward with quiet authority, their presence shifting the atmosphere in a way that could be felt before it was fully understood. And for the first time, Officer Hayes paused mid-motion, his hand still inside the bag as his attention flickered toward the approaching figures. A brief hesitation that did not yet register as concern but disrupted the rhythm of his control. The crowd followed his gaze, phones tilting, whispers rising slightly as people tried to make sense of what was unfolding, while Naomi remained exactly where she stood, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if this moment had always been part of the sequence. One of the suited individuals stepped forward, his voice firm but controlled as he addressed Hayes directly. "Officer, I need you to step back," the tone not loud, yet carrying a weight that did not invite argument. But Hayes, still holding onto the certainty he had built, straightened slightly, his expression tightening as he responded. "This is an active investigation. You are interfering." His words firm, but lacking the same quiet authority that now filled the space. The man did not raise his voice, did not react emotionally. He simply reached into his jacket and presented identification, holding it steady, allowing Hayes just enough time to read it. And in that brief second, something shifted, subtle but unmistakable, a crack forming in the confidence that had driven the entire encounter. Hayes glanced at the badge, then back at the man, then at the others behind him, each one composed, each one watching, and for the first time, the situation no longer felt like it belonged entirely to him. "We are taking over from here," the man continued, his voice even, as if stating something already decided. And a ripple moved through the crowd, confusion mixing with anticipation as phones captured every second. Hayes looked back at Naomi, as if reassessing her for the first time, truly seeing her rather than projecting onto her. But she did not meet his urgency with any reaction. She simply stood there, composed, her silence now carrying a different meaning, no longer passive, but deliberate. "Taking over what?" Hayes asked, his voice lower now, edged with something that was no longer certainty. And the man stepped slightly aside, his gaze shifting toward Naomi with a brief nod of acknowledgement, a gesture so subtle most of the crowd missed it, but not Hayes. The air seemed to hold its breath as Naomi finally moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with quiet intention, taking a single step forward, her eyes meeting Hayes with a calm that now felt heavier than before. And when she spoke, her voice was steady, controlled, and impossible to ignore. "You have everything you need, officer," she said, not as a question, not as a request, but as a statement that reframed the entire moment. Hayes did not respond immediately, because something in the way the scene had shifted, in the way the people around him now stood, In the way the crowd had gone from observing him to observing her, told him that whatever was happening, it was no longer under his control, and just behind him, more doors from the black SUV closed softly, as if sealing the moment in place before the truth fully revealed itself. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt heavy, like the air itself was waiting for something to be said, something that would finally make sense of the shift everyone could now feel. And Officer Hayes stood there, still holding the open bag, but no longer in control of the moment, his posture stiff, his thoughts racing behind a face that tried to hold on to authority that was already slipping. The man in the suit stepped closer, not aggressively, not urgently, but with a confidence that did not need to be proven, and with a slight motion of his hand, two others positioned themselves nearby, not surrounding Hayes, not escalating, just present in a way that quietly changed the balance of the scene. "Officer Hayes," the man said, reading the name from the badge without asking, his tone steady. "This situation is no longer under your jurisdiction," and the words landed with a weight that was impossible to ignore, not because they were loud, but because they carried certainty. Hayes blinked once, processing, his grip on the bag loosening slightly as he looked from the man back to Naomi. And for the first time, there was hesitation in his eyes, a question forming that he had not considered asking before. "Who exactly is she?" he said, the confidence in his voice now edged with something else, something closer to doubt. The crowd leaned in without moving, the quiet hum returning as people sensed that something important was about to be revealed. Phones steady, breaths held, and Naomi, who had said so little until now, took another step forward, closing the small distance between herself and the center of the moment, her presence no longer blending into the background but defining it. She reached out calmly and took her bag back, her movements smooth, unhurried, as if reclaiming something that had never truly been taken from her. And when she looked at Hayes again, there was no anger in her expression, no need to prove anything, only clarity. "You were looking for something that was never there," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough to reach him, and just enough to reach the people listening. And for a brief second, Hayes did not respond, because the statement did not feel like a defense, it felt like a conclusion. The man in the suit glanced at Naomi, a silent exchange passing between them, one that did not need words, and then he turned back to Hayes, holding his identification slightly higher this time, not as a challenge, but as confirmation. "You have been interacting with a federal operation," he said, each word deliberate, measured, "and you have interrupted it." And the realization did not hit all at once. It unfolded slowly across Hayes's face, the pieces connecting in a way that made everything he had done just moments ago feel different, heavier. Behind him, one of the agents spoke quietly into a communication device, while another scanned the area, their focus no longer on Hayes, but on something larger, something that had been in motion long before this encounter began. Naomi adjusted the strap of her bag over her shoulder, her posture returning to that same calm stillness from before, but now it carried a different meaning, not unnoticed, not questioned, but understood. And as the man in the suit took a final step forward, his voice lowered slightly, directed only at Hayes now, he said, "The next step depends on what happens right now." And in that moment, with the entire street watching, Hayes realized that the situation had shifted completely, and whatever came next would not be decided by him. Officer Hayes felt the weight of every eye on him as the street that once echoed with his authority now seemed to hold him in quiet judgment. The subtle shift undeniable, as the crowd no longer watched Naomi with suspicion, but looked at him with growing uncertainty. And for the first time, the uniform he wore did not feel like protection. It felt like exposure. His throat tightened slightly as he tried to steady his voice. "I was responding to a report," he said, but the words lacked the conviction they had only moments ago, because even as he spoke them, he could sense they no longer carried control over the situation. The man in the suit listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging the statement but not validating it. "And now you are standing in the middle of something far beyond that report," he replied calmly, his tone never rising, never needing to, because certainty did not require volume. Naomi stood just to the side, her presence composed, her eyes briefly scanning the surrounding area again as if confirming that everything was aligning exactly as it should, and in that stillness, there was a quiet authority that no badge could replicate. Hayes glanced around, noticing for the first time how many people had gathered, how many phones were pointed in his direction, capturing not just what had happened, but what was happening now. The shift, the unraveling of a moment, he thought he controlled, and he realized that every decision he made next would be seen, remembered, and questioned. If there has been a misunderstanding, he began again, his tone more measured now, less forceful, as if trying to regain ground that was already gone, but the man in the suit gently raised a hand, stopping him. Without aggression, "This is not about misunderstanding," he said, his voice steady. "This is about awareness." And the word lingered, heavier than any accusation, because it pointed not to what Hayes had done, but to what he had failed to see. A quiet ripple moved through the agents as one of them stepped closer and handed a small device to the lead, who glanced at it briefly before looking back at Naomi, receiving a slight nod from her in return, an exchange that confirmed something unseen to everyone else but fully understood between them. Naomi then turned her attention back to Hayes, her voice calm, but now carrying a clarity that left no room for interpretation. "There are moments when silence is not weakness," she said, her eyes steady on his. "It is observation." And for Hayes, the meaning landed deeper than the words themselves, because he began to understand that while he had been acting, she had been assessing, measuring, waiting. The distant sound of another vehicle approaching blended into the background as the scene settled into a new balance, one where Hayes was no longer leading, but responding, and the realization was not sudden. It was gradual, unfolding with each passing second as the authority he relied on shifted to something he could not challenge. The man in the suit stepped slightly to the side, giving Naomi the space to stand fully at the center now, not by force, but by recognition. And the crowd, though still silent, seemed to lean into that shift, sensing that whatever came next would redefine everything they had just witnessed. And in that moment, Hayes understood that the next words spoken would not just explain the situation, they would expose it. The moment stretched longer than anyone expected, not because nothing was happening, but because everything was aligning beneath the surface. And Naomi Carter stood at the center of it with a composure that no longer felt passive but deliberate, her silence now carrying the weight of control rather than restraint, while Officer Hayes remained fixed in place, his thoughts racing to catch up with a reality that had already moved ahead of him. The man in the suit glanced briefly toward the surrounding agents, each one positioned with quiet precision, not creating tension but containing it, ensuring that whatever unfolded next would do so without disruption. And then he turned his attention fully to Naomi, giving a subtle nod that was less permission and more acknowledgement. Naomi stepped forward once more, closing the final distance between herself and Hayes, her presence now unmistakable, no longer blending into the background of the street, but defining the moment entirely. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, steady, and clear enough to reach not only him but everyone listening. "You were not wrong to ask questions," she said, her tone measured, not accusatory, but firm in its clarity. "But you were wrong to decide the answer before you listened." And the words settled over the crowd like a quiet realization, shifting the narrative from action to understanding. Hayes swallowed, the weight of her statement pressing against the certainty he had relied on, and for the first time, he did not immediately respond, because there was nothing simple left to say, nothing that would restore what had already shifted. Naomi continued, her gaze steady. "There is a difference between enforcing the law and assuming it," she added, her voice never rising, yet carrying more authority than anything spoken before. And behind her, one of the agents stepped forward just enough to place a small, official-looking folder into the lead agent's hand, who opened it briefly, before closing it again, confirming what had already been understood. The lead agent then addressed Hayes once more, his tone unchanged. "This operation has been active for several weeks," he said, each word deliberate, "and every detail matters." And while he did not elaborate further, the implication was clear. This moment, this interaction, was now part of something much larger than Hayes had ever considered. A quiet shift moved through the crowd as people began to piece together what they were witnessing not just a confrontation, but a reversal, a moment where perception had been challenged and authority redefined without a single raised voice. Naomi adjusted her sleeve slightly, a small, composed gesture that contrasted sharply with the tension still lingering in the air. And then she looked at Hayes one final time, not with anger, not with triumph, but with a calm certainty that left no room for misunderstanding. "The question is not what you thought you saw," she said softly. "It is what you chose not to see." And the words lingered, heavier than any command, because they spoke to something deeper than the moment itself. Hayes stood there, the noise of the city slowly returning around him, cars passing, voices rising again. But the scene remained suspended in a way that made it feel separate from everything else, as if time had paused just long enough for the truth to settle. And in that space, it became clear to everyone watching that whatever came next would not erase what had happened, it would define it. For a long moment, no one spoke, not because there was nothing left to say, but because every word that mattered had already been placed into the air, settling slowly into the space between them. And Officer Hayes stood there feeling the shift in a way he could not ignore, the weight of Naomi Carter's words echoing louder than any command he had given earlier, as the certainty he once carried now unraveled into something quieter, something far more difficult to confront. The crowd, once drawn by curiosity, now held a different kind of attention, one that no longer searched for spectacle but for meaning, as if everyone present understood that they were witnessing something beyond a simple encounter, something that revealed more about perception than procedure. Hayes glanced down briefly, not in defeat, but in reflection, his grip loosening at his sides as the tension that had driven his actions gave way to a realization he had not prepared for. And when he looked back up, his voice, when it came, was no longer sharp or commanding, but measured, almost careful. "I followed protocol," he said, though even as he spoke, the words felt incomplete, as if they no longer answered the question being asked. Naomi watched him without interruption, her expression unchanged, but there was something in her gaze now that suggested she was no longer assessing him as a situation, but as a person standing at a crossroads of understanding. And after a brief pause, she responded, her tone calm but unwavering. "Protocol is a framework," she said, "but judgment is a choice." And the distinction hung in the air, clear and undeniable. Behind her, the agents remained still, their presence no longer shifting the scene but holding it steady, allowing the moment to unfold without interference, as if this realization, was not theirs to control. Hayes exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, but enough to signal the change within him, as the rigid structure of certainty gave way to something more uncertain, more human. And for the first time since the encounter began, he did not try to assert control over the situation. He simply stood within it, acknowledging its weight. A few people in the crowd lowered their phones slightly, not because the moment had lost its intensity, but because it had transformed into something quieter, something that did not need to be captured to be understood. Naomi adjusted her stance subtly, her posture still composed, but now carrying a finality that suggested the moment of confrontation had passed, replaced by something deeper, something reflective, and she spoke once more, her voice softer now, but no less powerful. "What you do next," she said, "is the only part of this that still belongs to you." And with that, the focus shifted entirely to Hayes, not as an officer, not as authority, but as an individual faced with the consequence of his choices. The city noise began to return in the distance, blending back into the scene as cars moved and voices resumed, but the space they stood in remained distinct, as if marked by what had just occurred. And Hayes realized that while the moment itself was coming to an end, its meaning would not fade so easily, because the lesson it carried was not about what had happened, but about what had been revealed. And in that quiet understanding, the power of the situation had fully shifted, not through force, but through truth. The moment did not end with a command or a sudden movement. It lingered, stretching quietly, as if the street itself understood that something deeper had taken place, something that could not simply be dismissed or walked away from. And Officer Hayes remained where he stood, the weight of Naomi Carter's final words settling into him in a way that was slower, but far more lasting than any immediate reaction. his mind replaying the sequence, not to defend it, but to understand it. Around them, the crowd began to shift, not dispersing entirely, but loosening, as if the need to witness had been replaced by the need to process, phones lowering, whispers softening, yet no one fully leaving. Because there was still an unspoken question hanging in the air. What would he do next? Hayes inhaled slowly, his shoulders rising and falling with a controlled breath, and when he finally moved, it was not with authority, not with urgency, but with intention, as he stepped back slightly, creating space where before he had closed it. A small gesture that carried more meaning than any words he could have chosen in that moment. His eyes met Naomi's again, and this time there was no attempt to read her, no assumption layered over observation, only acknowledgement. And in that silent exchange, something shifted again, not in power, but in understanding. "I made a call based on what I thought I saw," he said, his voice steady, not defensive, not apologetic in a performative way, but grounded in recognition. And while the statement did not undo what had happened, it marked a change in how he stood within it. Naomi did not respond immediately, her gaze holding his for a moment longer as if measuring the sincerity behind the words, not judging, not dismissing, simply observing. And then she gave a slight nod, not of approval, but of acknowledgement, the same quiet recognition she had carried throughout the entire encounter. Behind her, the lead agent closed the folder in his hands and spoke briefly into his communication device, his voice low, controlled, confirming details that remained beyond the awareness of the crowd. And one by one, the other agents began to ease their stance, not stepping away entirely, but shifting from intervention to presence, as if the critical moment had passed and what remained now belonged to the people at its center. A passing car slowed slightly as it moved through the intersection, the driver glancing toward the scene, sensing the tension that still lingered even as the visible conflict faded. And somewhere in the background, a distant siren echoed faintly before dissolving into the city noise. Hayes glanced briefly at the people around him, noticing how their expressions had changed, how the narrative they had been building in their minds had been interrupted, challenged, reshaped. And he understood then that this moment was no longer just about him and Naomi. It had become something larger, something witnessed, something that would carry forward beyond this street. Naomi adjusted the strap of her bag once more, her posture returning fully to that quiet composure. But now it carried a sense of closure, as if she had already moved beyond the moment even while standing within it. And when she spoke again, her voice was softer, but no less certain. "Awareness does not come from being right," she said. "It comes from being willing to see differently." And the words did not linger as a challenge, but as a reflection, something left behind rather than imposed. Hayes listened, not interrupting, not resisting, and in that stillness, it became clear that whatever authority he had brought into this moment had been replaced by something else entirely, something quieter, something that did not need to be asserted to be real. And as the agents began to turn their attention outward, preparing to move forward with whatever had been set into motion long before this encounter, the street slowly returned to its rhythm. But for those who had witnessed it, the meaning of what had just happened would not fade so easily, because it was not the confrontation they would remember, it was the shift. The street slowly exhaled as the tension that had held it in place began to dissolve, but something deeper remained, something unspoken that lingered in the air like a quiet echo. And Naomi Carter could feel it, not as pressure, but as awareness, the kind that settles after truth has been revealed without force, without spectacle. She turned slightly, her attention shifting beyond Officer Hayes, her eyes scanning the far end of the street where the black SUV remained idling, its presence subtle yet purposeful, a reminder that what had unfolded here was never isolated. It was part of something already in motion. The lead agent stepped closer to her, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "We are clear to proceed," he said, and Naomi gave a small nod, her expression unchanged, as if the entire encounter had been nothing more than a brief interruption in a much larger timeline. Hayes watched this exchange carefully, no longer trying to assert himself, but trying to understand, his perspective shifting from control to observation, and for the first time, he realized that he had stepped into a moment that had already been written long before he arrived. "What operation?" he asked, his voice quieter now, not demanding, but searching, and the lead agent glanced at him briefly before responding. The kind that depends on details being handled correctly. His answer deliberate, revealing just enough to confirm the weight of the situation without exposing what could not be shared. Hayes absorbed the response, nodding slightly, not because he fully understood, but because he recognized that understanding was no longer his role in this moment. Naomi adjusted the cuff of her sleeve with a calm precision, her posture returning fully to its composed stillness. And then she spoke, not to correct him, not to explain everything, but to leave something behind that would outlast the moment. Not every situation is what it appears to be at first glance, she said, her voice steady. And not every answer is meant to be found the same way. And her words did not feel like instruction. They felt like a reflection, something meant to be carried forward rather than resolved immediately. A faint breeze moved through the street, lifting loose papers near a nearby storefront, the subtle motion breaking the stillness as the city began to reclaim its rhythm. Cars passing, voices returning, footsteps continuing as if the moment had folded itself back into the ordinary flow of the day. Yet for those who had witnessed it, nothing felt entirely the same. One by one, members of the crowd began to step away, their expressions thoughtful, their conversations quieter, as if they were still processing what they had just seen, not as an event, but as a realization. Hayes remained where he stood for a moment longer, his gaze shifting from Naomi to the agents, then back again, and in that pause, it became clear that the role he had played in this encounter was no longer defined by authority, but by what he chose to take from it. Naomi turned toward the waiting vehicle, her movements smooth and unhurried, as if time itself had adjusted to match her pace. And as she walked, the agents naturally fell into step around her, not leading, not following, but aligning, their presence reinforcing something that did not need to be announced. Just before she reached the vehicle, Naomi paused briefly, not turning back fully, but just enough for her voice to carry over her shoulder, calm and clear. "Some truths are not hidden," she said. "They are simply overlooked." And then she continued forward, the door opening seamlessly as she approached, the quiet precision of the moment leaving no room for doubt that whatever had just occurred was only a fragment of something much larger, something that had not yet fully revealed itself. The door of the black SUV closed with a soft, controlled sound that barely registered above the returning noise of the city. Yet for those who had been watching, it marked the quiet conclusion of something far more significant than it first appeared. And as the vehicle remained still for just a moment longer, Naomi Carter sat inside with the same composed stillness she had carried throughout the entire encounter, her gaze shifting briefly through the tinted window, as if confirming that every piece had fallen into place exactly as intended. Outside, the agents moved with quiet efficiency, no urgency, no unnecessary motion, each step deliberate as they returned to their positions, and within seconds, the presence that had once dominated the street began to fade into something almost invisible, blending back into the rhythm of the city as if they had never been there at all. Officer Hayes remained on the sidewalk, watching as the scene dissolved around him, the crowd now dispersing fully, conversations resuming in low tones, people carrying the moment with them as they walked away, some shaking their heads, others silent, but all changed in ways they could not yet fully articulate. Hayes exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering as the weight of the situation settled into something more permanent, something that would not leave with the crowd or the agents or the vehicle that now began to pull away from the curb with smooth precision, merging into traffic without drawing attention, disappearing into the flow of the city as if it had never stopped at all. For a brief moment, Hayes considered calling after them, asking for clarity, for answers, for something that would help him make sense of what had just happened. But the thought faded almost as quickly as it came, replaced by the understanding that not every situation was meant to be explained in the moment, and not every answer was something he was meant to receive. He looked down at his hands, now empty, the absence of the bag he had held earlier feeling more significant than its presence ever had. And in that small detail, he recognized the shift, not just in the situation, but in himself. Across the street, a woman who had been recording lowered her phone completely, her expression thoughtful as she turned away, while a man nearby adjusted his jacket, and walked on without a word, the moment already becoming something internal rather than external. Hayes turned slightly, glancing at his patrol car, the familiar symbol of his role now carrying a different weight, not diminished, but reframed, as if the authority it represented required something more than certainty, something deeper than assumption. The faint reflection of the departing SUV caught in the window of a nearby storefront for just a second before vanishing entirely, and with it, the visible trace of Naomi Carter's presence disappeared, leaving behind only the impact of what she had revealed without ever needing to declare it. Hayes stepped back toward his vehicle, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as if each step carried the quiet realization that this encounter had not been about control or procedure, but about perception, about the difference between seeing and understanding. He paused before opening the car door, his gaze drifting briefly down the street where everything had unfolded, now indistinguishable from any other moment in the city, and yet entirely different. And as he finally reached for the handle, one thought remained, not loud, not overwhelming, but steady and undeniable. That's sometimes the most powerful lesson is not the one that is forced upon you, but the one you are left to carry long after the moment has passed. The city moved on as it always did, indifferent to the moments that quietly reshaped the people within it. And Officer Daniel Hayes sat inside his patrol car with the engine running, but he had not yet pulled away, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel as he stared ahead at the same street that now felt unfamiliar, not because it had changed, but because he had. The radio crackled softly in the background, routine chatter filling the silence, calls being dispatched, officers responding, the steady rhythm of a system continuing without pause. Yet for Hayes, the sound felt distant, almost muted, as if he were hearing it from somewhere else entirely. His mind replayed the encounter again, not in fragments, but in full clarity, each word, each look, each moment where he had acted without question, and now, for the first time, he questioned all of it. He leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose as his gaze shifted to the side mirror, catching a glimpse of pedestrians walking by, none of them paying him any attention now, none of them seeing what had just unfolded. And yet he knew that for some, for those who had stayed and watched, the memory would remain, not as an accusation, but as a reminder. He reached up and adjusted his badge unconsciously, the small metal emblem reflecting a sliver of light as it settled back against his chest. And for a brief moment, he saw it differently, not as authority, but as responsibility, something that required more than reaction, more than assumption. The weight of that realization sat with him, not heavy, in a crushing way, but steady, like something that would not fade with time, something that would stay with him long after this shift ended. A voice from the radio broke through more clearly this time, calling his unit number, and Hayes responded instinctively, his tone professional, composed, but there was a difference now, something subtle, something measured, as if each word carried more awareness than before. Unit 12, status check, the dispatcher said, and Hayes paused for just a fraction of a second before replying. Unit 12, all clear. The words simple, routine, but behind them, there was a quiet acknowledgement that nothing about this moment had been routine. He placed the car into drive, his movements deliberate, not rushed, as he pulled away from the curb and merged into traffic, the city surrounding him once again, familiar streets, familiar patterns, but now layered with a perspective he had not carried before. As he drove, he found himself noticing details he might have overlooked before, the expressions of people on the sidewalk, the small interactions at intersections, the subtle ways in which presence and perception shaped every moment. And he understood then that what had happened was not just about one encounter, it was about the way he would approach every encounter after it. Somewhere ahead, the traffic light shifted from red to green, and Hayes eased forward, his grip steady on the wheel, his focus clear, not just on the road, but on the choices that would follow, the decisions that would define not just his role, but his understanding of it. And though Naomi Carter was no longer there, though the black SUV had disappeared into the flow of the city, her words remained, not as instructions, not as judgment, but as something quieter, something that stayed with him in the space between action and thought, reminding him that the line between seeing and understanding was not as simple as he once believed, and that crossing that line would be the true measure of everything that came next. The hours that followed did not bring closure in the way stories often promise. There was no sudden resolution, no clear line drawn between what had happened and what it meant. But instead, there was something quieter, something that settled into the spaces between routine moments, shaping them without announcing itself. And Officer Daniel Hayes felt it in the way he moved through the rest of his shift, in the way he listened, in the way he paused before speaking. The city continued around him with its usual rhythm. Calls came in, situations unfolded, people needed help, and he responded as he always had. But there was a difference now. Subtle, yet unmistakable. A space between observation and conclusion that had not been there before. At a small intersection just past Fifth Avenue, he slowed his vehicle as a pedestrian hesitated at the crosswalk, their movement uncertain, their body language unclear, and for a brief moment, the old instinct surfaced, quick, decisive, ready to define the situation before it fully revealed itself. But this time, Hayes waited, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, giving the moment the time it needed to unfold on its own. The pedestrian eventually stepped forward, offering a small nod of thanks as they crossed, and Hayes continued on. The exchange simple, almost insignificant, yet it carried a weight that only he could feel, because it marked a shift in how he chose to see. Later, parked along a quiet street lined with brick buildings and fading sunlight, Hayes rested his arm against the window frame, watching as the day softened into evening, the golden light reflecting off glass and pavement. And in that stillness, his thoughts returned, not with urgency, but with clarity. He understood now that what had happened earlier was not just an interruption. It was a mirror, one that had reflected something he had not fully examined before, something that did not define him entirely, but shaped how he acted within the moments that mattered most. He reached for his radio again, responding to another routine check, his voice steady, composed, but now grounded in something deeper. Then procedure, something that required not just presence, but understanding. Across the street, a group of people laughed as they walked out of a small cafe, their conversation light, their expressions unburdened, and Hayes watched them for a moment, recognizing how easily a single assumption could alter a moment like that, how quickly perception could shift reality if left unchecked. And he realized that awareness was not something gained once. It was something practiced, something chosen again and again. The sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows across the pavement, and as the day moved toward its end, Hayes sat quietly with the understanding that not every lesson comes with instruction. Not every correction comes with consequence. Sometimes it comes in the form of a moment that changes how you see, how you think, how you act when no one is watching. And somewhere, far beyond his line of sight, Naomi Carter continued her work, her presence moving through spaces unseen, her influence shaping outcomes that would never be publicly acknowledged, yet felt in ways that could not be measured. And though their paths had crossed only briefly, the impact of that intersection remained, not as a memory to revisit, but as a standard to carry forward, a reminder that true awareness does not arrive all at once. It builds, quietly, steadily, in the choices made after the moment has passed. The night settled over the city with a quiet certainty, the kind that softened the edges of everything it touched, and Officer Daniel Hayes found himself parked once more beneath the glow of a streetlight, the hum of his engine low, steady, almost rhythmic, as if echoing the thoughts that had not left him since that afternoon. The streets were calmer now, the rush of the day replaced by a slower pace, headlights passing in measured intervals, footsteps quieter, conversations more contained, and, in that stillness, there was space to reflect, not just on what had happened, but on what it meant moving forward. Hayes leaned back slightly in his seat, his eyes tracing the outline of the city he thought he understood, now layered with a perspective that had shifted something fundamental within him, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to change the way he would see every moment that followed. He thought about the encounter again, not as a mistake to erase, but as a point of clarity, a moment where assumption had been replaced by awareness, where certainty had given way to understanding, and in that shift, there was something lasting, something that would not fade with time. The radio remained quiet for a rare stretch, and Hayes allowed the silence to sit, not filling it, not pushing past it, because for the first time, He understood the value of that pause, the space where observation lives before judgment takes over. Across the street, a single light flickered on in an apartment window. Someone returning home, someone stepping into their own story, unseen, uninterrupted, and Hayes watched for a moment, recognizing how many moments like that existed every day, how easily they could be misunderstood if viewed through assumption instead of awareness. He adjusted his posture, his hand resting lightly on the wheel, no tension, no urgency, just presence, and in that presence, there was a quiet commitment forming, not spoken, not declared, but understood, a decision. To approach each moment with a different lens, one that required more than reaction, more than surface-level observation. Somewhere far beyond the streets he patrolled, Naomi Carter moved through a world that operated in silence, where influence did not need recognition to exist, where impact was measured not by visibility, but by precision, and though her path had crossed his only briefly, the imprint of that moment remained, not as a reminder of power, but as a reflection of what true control looked like when it did not need to be proven. Hayes started the engine forward again, easing into the quiet flow of the night, his movements steady, deliberate, carrying with him something that could not be seen, but would shape everything that followed. And as the city stretched out before him, unchanged yet entirely different, one thought settled in with quiet certainty, not loud, not forceful, but lasting, that he had once believed the badge gave him authority over the moment, but now he understood that the moment itself demands something far greater, something earned not through assumption, but through the discipline to see beyond it, because in the end, he thought he was the law, but that day, the law showed him a different face.